California's governor has sparked a row over the death penalty by granting a reprieve to the more than 700 inmates who were facing execution. The state hasn't put any prisoners to death since 2006. This moratorium ensures that will remain the case, at least while the governor stays in office. It's a move that's drawn praise from groups who've long campaigned to end the death penalty. But nationwide, capital punishment still has its supporters. They argue it's sometimes an appropriate and cost-effective punishment. So could California's ban change the nation's response to the most serious crimes? Well, to help unpack that, let's go to Los Angeles, where we're joined by former district attorney and anti-death penalty activist Gil Garcetti. In Salem, Oregon is Frank Thompson. He's a former death row warden who's personally supervised executions. And in Portland, Oregon, we have Joshua Marquis, former district attorney and author of Debating the Death Penalty. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. Joshua, let me start with you. Do you agree with Gavin Newsom that this is a barbaric practice that denies human dignity and should be put to an end?
I do not, and I think what is significant is that in most of America, certainly in California and Oregon, this really important decision is left to voters. Voters decided to bring the death penalty in, and sometimes they've decided to abolish it. And it's very significant that voters in California, as little as 2 years ago, the same year that Donald Trump was elected nationally, although he lost heavily in California, the same voters that voted for Hillary Clinton also voted to reject by about 4 or 5 percentage points as an abolition. So it's clear that what Governor Newsom is doing, as you explained, is he's not commuting the sentences, which is within his power. He's simply doing what we would call an extra legal maneuver. In other words, it's not something that's called for in the law, but it does allow him, because he's the one who has to sign the death warrants, to simply stop any progression. The usual argument is so we can have a conversation. We've been having this conversation for 60, 70 years in America.
Okay, so Gil, Governor Newsom doing what the voters didn't want when he put it to the test twice. So isn't that a democratic reflection that the people still, it might be by a slim majority, but the people still want the death penalty?
The issue is what happens when people learn the facts? What happens when they realize that the death penalty serves no useful purpose? It's obscenely expensive. And with 734 people on California's death row, I can guarantee you there is at least one and probably more people who do not deserve to be on death row because they were either innocent or they simply do not deserve to be there. They may deserve to be in prison for the rest of their life, but not the death penalty.
But Gil, is it because of the morality of it all or the bungling of it all? Is it that it's not being properly applied, that's why it needs to go, or morally it's wrong?
Well, I don't speak for the governor, but what he did was a very brave thing, and he talks about the morality of the death penalty. I look at it slightly differently. I look at it in terms of, is it effective? What are we doing with this? Can we afford this kind of penalty when it's so obscenely expensive? And what about the moral issue and just the justice issue about potentially executing a person who is innocent of the crime? We've had over 168 cases throughout the country where people who've been on death row have been freed because they were not guilty.
Frank Thompson, as somebody who's been there when inmates have experienced, I guess, their final lap of life, and you were involved in the taking of it, while you were doing this and in the aftermath, do you feel as if you were serving justice?
In the aftermath, I was convinced that I had not been serving justice. A big part of the problem, as I see it, is that most of the people who support the death penalty don't look at it as a public policy with a desire to have positive outcomes that serve the broader community well. The death penalty is largely supported out of emotions and vengeance. And Governor Newsom's moratorium has put the issue back on the table where there can continue to be an education of the public to the larger implications of how the death penalty has failed. It wasn't until I went through that experience that I became acutely aware that I was training innocent, from a moral standpoint, certainly, men and women to take the life of a human being in the name of a public policy that cannot be shown to work.
Let me ask you, Joshua, if you agree with, firstly, Frank, but also when Governor Newsom says there's no such thing as equal justice, so putting the death penalty aside in a sense, right, he's questioning the very nature of the criminal justice system in the United States. He's saying not when 2/3 of death row people are people of color, not when 1/3 of those on death row represented have severe mental illness. So he's saying the whole system's broke. Would you perhaps then agree that the whole system's broke, but that perhaps the death penalty per se is not under discussion? It's about everything being broken.
No, I think the criminal justice system has a lot of work to do. I've worked in it at the very base level, meaning that I've been in court, I've gone to crime scenes, I was a district attorney that got called out when murder happens. It's not a academic, nor is it a particularly emotional thing. I disagree strongly with what Mr. Thompson said, that most people who support the death penalty do so out of some sort of bloodlust. The death penalty in the United States, particularly in the Western states like Oregon and California, in modern era, meaning the last 40 years, has been handed down in a very, very small subset. We're talking about 1% of murderers or less. And the question one has to ask, and unfortunately we have the answer, is what happens when you have people who murder again and again, who get sentenced to prison, as several of the people on Oregon's death row did, for murder, and are doing life in prison for murder and continue to murder people, often other inmates. Should their lives be worth any less? I just don't think that's I don't think that's a fair or moral judgment.
Okay, so let me add something to that, and Gil can respond, right? So, Gil, what about those people who continue to kill, right? I mean, there's this idea that there's no semblance of catharsis and there's no way back for them. We've heard from, in an interview, Marquis, the father of a girl notoriously kidnapped from a slumber party and killed in 1993 in California, who said the governor's action is, ironically, Trumpian in its willingness to curb the practice to one's own personal philosophy, i.e., here's a father, Marquis, who's very unhappy. His kid was killed. And he's saying that Newsom's doing this for his own political purposes, not because of justice. Respond to that, Gil.
Well, Governor Newsom did something I said is extremely brave. He knew what the blowback was going to be on this, but he has talked about his position on the death penalty for years and years. This is not something new. It's totally within his authority to do what he has done. He has not abolished the death penalty. Your headline at the beginning of the program was a little misleading, is that it's not abolished. It's still there. My guess is he will take this to the voters. And if there is sufficient information going out to the voters about that it serves no useful purpose, I think everyone has now agreed there is no proof at all that it's a deterrent. So what is it? It's not, I think, as Joshua said, a bloodlust that he attributed to Frank. Frank didn't say that. He said it comes down to vengeance, perhaps. And that is it doesn't serve a useful purpose. Why do we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars where we should be working to keep kids in school? If we keep kids in school, the chances are they're the ones who are not going to be in the criminal justice system.
Right. Frank, I want you to respond to your president. Let me read out his tweet. He said, defying voters, the governor of California will halt all death penalty executions of 737 stone-cold killers. Friends and families of the always forgotten victims are not thrilled, and neither am I. That's President Donald Trump. Frank, respond to your president.
To repeal the death penalty will reduce the number of victims. We already have a certain number of victims at the administration of capital punishment. And why move forward in increasing the number? And when I say increasing the number, I'm talking about the staff who are required to take the life of another human being and face a lifelong possibility, probability, and this can be researched by going to Google, of PTSD, suicidal tendencies, broken homes, alcoholism. Why take a policy and administer it, and it can't be shown to work, and you increase the number of victims with the resources that are realized? And in this country, we have all the intelligence and capability to identify those resources and do a better job of treating the needs of those who have already been victimized. It is not like the advocates for abolition are neglecting and abandoning the needs of those who are already victims. We're trying to create a community where there are fewer murders as there have been in the past.
Josh, I want to ask you if this is a bellwether for the nation, because even though you say, yes, in California, the voters said, no, we still want the death penalty twice under Gavin Newsom. He's gone ahead with this. Yes, it's not an abolition. This is a moratorium for now. But looking at it state by state and federally as well, their Pew polls, their Gallup polls, over the years, over the decades, we're showing those numbers are changing. And not only is the United States an outlier when it comes to wealthy industrialized nations in still having the death penalty, but people are more and more against it. So are we seeing that this little technical change is essentially a part of a roadmap to abolition across the United States?
Well, that's a several-part question. Part of this is not a great morally courageous act by Gavin Newsom. If he really wanted to take that morally courageous an act, when he ran for governor 6 months ago, he could have said, my cornerstone when I run for governor is going to be that I am going to declare a moratorium on the death penalty. Take that position. May not have made any difference in whether he got elected or not, but to do it basically, I'm not calling Newsom a coward, but I don't think it's any great act of political courage to do it now. It's often said that America is one of the few or only westernized industrial democracies. Well, there's something inherently ethnocentric in that. Japan has the death penalty and uses it in a way that, which is a very developed, very sophisticated democracy. So do a number of other Southeast Asian countries. The reason that no one in Europe has the death penalty is because the ticket for admission to the European community, understandably with Germany and Italy having the recent history they did, is you have to forswear the death penalty. So a lot of these claims that we're a bunch of uncivilized, brutalitarians. Mr. Thompson has talked about how the process can be very hard on the people in prison. I have no doubt of that.
Okay, and we're keeping a close eye on California, Oregon, Washington State, Colorado, because these conversations are happening there right this moment. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you all on the program. I hope to have you back on the program in the future. Gil Garcetti, Joshua Marquis, and Frank Thompson.
Thank you.
Thanks again.